The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the deserted highway. Alex adjusted his name tag and glanced at the clock. 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes until his shift officially started. He had heard the stories about the station's graveyard shift, but brushed them off as local folklore. After all, a job was a job, and he needed the money. The first hour passed uneventfully. Alex spent most of his time scrolling through his phone and occasionally glancing at the surveillance monitors. For cameras covered the tiny establishment. One on the pumps, one inside the store, one by the stockroom, and one at the station's rear exit. He watched the empty lot on the monitors, the silence pressing in around him. At 1:13 a.m., the first strange thing happened. A faint sound, like shuffling footsteps, echoed from the stockroom. Alex froze, his fingers hovering over the counter. He peered toward the stockroom door, which was slightly ajar. "Hello," he called out, his voice wavering slightly. No response. Gathering his courage, Alex grabbed a flashlight and pushed the door open. The stockroom was as it always was, a cluttered mess of shelves stocked with cleaning supplies and boxes of chips. He waved the flashlight around, illuminating the corners. Nothing. The sound must have been his imagination, he thought. Yet, as he turned to leave, a box tumbled off the top shelf, landing with a heavy thud. Alex jumped, his heart pounding. He stared at the box as if it might move again. With a deep breath, he placed it back on the shelf and returned to the counter, trying to shake off the unease. At 2 a.m., the pumps began to act up. Pump 3, which had been out of order for weeks, lit up on the monitor. Alex frowned and tapped the screen, thinking it might be a glitch. But then the monitor displayed something chilling. A figure stood near pump 3, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. They wore a long coat, and their face was obscured by the hood. "What the hell?" Alex muttered. He picked up the phone to call his manager, but stopped. The figure was gone. He rewound the footage, but there was no trace of anyone. Alex's hands shook as he set the phone down. Maybe he was overtired. He decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping it would calm his nerves. As he stepped into the chilly night, the silence was deafening. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, devoid of cars or life. He walked toward pump 3, his breath visible in the cold air. Nothing seemed out of place. "Just my imagination," he whispered, turning back toward the station. That's when he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like his name, Alex. He spun around, the flashlight's beam darting across the empty lot. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. No answer. Rushing back inside, Alex locked the doors and drew the blinds. His heart thudded in his chest as he tried to rationalize the events. He sat at the counter, staring at the monitors, hoping the hours would pass quickly. At 3 a.m., the power went out. The station was plunged into darkness, save for the dim emergency lights. Alex's phone flashlight became his only source of illumination. The hum of the refrigerator ceased, and the silence grew oppressive. Then, the tapping began. It started as a faint sound, like someone gently tapping on glass. Alex's stomach churned as he realized it was coming from the front door. He turned the flashlight toward the glass, but saw nothing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Go away," Alex yelled, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. He held his breath, straining to hear any movement. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the faint buzzing of his phone. He had received a message. "Don't turn around." Alex's blood ran cold. His hands shook as he slowly lifted his phone, the flashlight beam trembling. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Against every instinct, he turned. The stockroom door was wide open. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, shrouded in shadow. Their head tilted unnaturally, and their eyes gleamed like two tiny pinpricks of light. Alex stumbled backward, nearly dropping his phone. The figure didn't move, but seemed to watch him, studying him. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex bolted for the exit. As he yanked the door open, a blaring horn startled him. A truck roared past on the highway, its headlights momentarily blinding him. He looked back at the station, expecting the figure to follow, but the store was empty. The stockroom door was closed. The power flickered back on. Everything was as it had been. Breathing heavily, Alex sat down at the counter, trying to collect his thoughts. But the reprieve didn't last long. On the monitor, the stockroom camera displayed static before clearing up to reveal something new. Written on the back wall in what looked like black, dripping paint were the words, "You can't leave." Panic surged through Alex. He grabbed his car keys and darted toward the door, determined to get away. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed again. He ignored it and started the engine, but the vehicle sputtered and died. He tried again, but it was no use. The headlights flickered, and in their glow, Alex saw the figure standing by the entrance, closer than before. He slammed the door lock shut, gripping the steering wheel as the figure began walking toward him. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unseen force. The figure stopped just outside the driver's window. Alex couldn't see its face, but he could feel its gaze piercing through him. A muffled voice emanated from it, distorted and inhuman. "Stay," it whispered. Alex's mind raced. Desperation overtook him as he scrambled out of the passenger side and ran toward the highway. He flagged down the first car he saw, a beat-up sedan driven by an elderly man. "Please, you have to help me," Alex pleaded, yanking open the passenger door. The man looked at him with a mix of confusion and fear. "What's wrong, son?" Something's after me," Alex stammered, glancing back at the station. The figure was gone. The old man sighed and gestured for Alex to get in. "Let's get you out of here." Relief washed over Alex as the car pulled onto the highway. He looked back at the gas station one last time, but his blood ran cold. In the rearview mirror, he saw the figure sitting in the back seat, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Alex screamed as the car swerved violently. The old man shouted, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The vehicle careened off the road, tumbling into a ditch. When Alex came to, he was lying on the cold ground. The car was gone, the highway empty. He staggered to his feet, disoriented and terrified. His phone buzzed again. This time, the message read, "Welcome back." Alex turned and saw the gas station, its fluorescent lights flickering invitingly. He was back, standing at the entrance as if he had never left. The clock inside read 11:57 p.m. His shift was about to begin. No matter how far he ran, Alex realized the curse would always bring him back. The night shift wasn't just a job, it was a prison, one he could never escape. It was a late evening when Claire found herself standing in the dimly lit lobby of the old hotel, a place she had reluctantly booked after her car broke down on the side of the highway. The neon sign outside flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the deserted parking lot. The hotel was far from modern, with faded wallpaper and squeaky floors, but it was her only option for the night. A storm was rolling in, and she knew better than to try to make it through the winding roads in this weather. As she stepped inside, the door creaked, sending a cold shiver down her spine. The lobby was quiet, too quiet. A musty odor hung in the air, and the flickering light above seemed like it was on the verge of going out entirely. She walked up to the front desk, but no one was there. The bell beside the register sat untouched, as if it hadn't been rung in years. Claire hesitated for a moment before pressing the bell herself. A soft chime echoed through the room, but no one appeared. She frowned, feeling a bit uncomfortable. The hotel wasn't exactly bustling with guests. There were no cars in the lot, no sounds of laughter or conversation. Just silence. She pressed the bell again, harder this time. Still, there was no response. It was then that she heard the footsteps. At first, they were faint, like the soft shuffle of slippers on carpet. Claire turned her head, expecting to see an older, disheveled hotel clerk appear from the back office. But no one came. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, but there was still no one in sight. Claire's heartbeat quickened, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She glanced around the empty lobby, her eyes landing on the stairs leading to the upper floors. The footsteps seemed to be coming from that direction now, but they were irregular. One step, then another, but never quite in rhythm, like someone struggling to move. Then there was a soft cough. Claire froze. "Can I help you, miss?" The voice came from behind her, right next to her ear. It was low, almost a whisper, and the breath on her neck made her skin crawl. Claire whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. but there was no one there. Nothing but the dusty, empty lobby. Her breath hitched as she quickly turned back to the desk. The bell was gone. The counter was now completely bare. No bell, no sign of the attendant. Claire felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. She had to get out, but as she moved toward the door, a figure appeared at the top of the staircase. It was a tall man, dressed in a worn uniform, one that looked far too old-fashioned for a modern hotel. His face was obscured in shadows, his features too faint to make out clearly, but there was something about him that seemed wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural, as if he was frozen in place. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at her with an unsettling stillness. "Room 22, he said in the same whisper, his voice distant and hollow. "You can rest in room 22. It's waiting for you." Claire's stomach twisted. Room 22? There was no such room listed on the hotel's brochure. She hadn't even seen a door marked with that number. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper, a mix of confusion and fear taking hold of her. The figure didn't respond, only repeated the same phrase. "Room 22. It's waiting for you." Her mind raced. She needed to leave, to get out of this place before whatever was happening consumed her. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, her legs refusing to move, as if some invisible force was holding her back. She glanced over at the front door, but it was no longer the exit she had come through. Now it was a solid wall, the doorway completely gone. Panic started to rise in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Room 22, the figure said again, his voice growing louder, more insistent, though he still hadn't moved an inch from the top of the stairs. Suddenly, Claire found herself walking toward the staircase, her legs moving on their own accord, as if some unseen force was guiding her steps. She tried to fight it, but it was useless. Her feet dragged her closer to the man at the top of the stairs. The chill in the air thickened, and her heart hammered in her chest. When she reached the bottom step, the man finally moved. He turned his head slightly, enough for Claire to see a glint of his eyes. They were pale, milky white, devoid of life. There was no humanity in them, only emptiness. "Come," he said, his voice growing hoarse and strained. "It's time." Claire's body screamed for her to stop, to turn back, but she couldn't. She ascended the stairs as if in a trance, the air growing colder with every step. The figure led her down a narrow hallway, the wallpaper peeling away, revealing damp patches of mold beneath. She could barely see through the haze of her fear, but something felt wrong with every passing moment. The lights flickered as they moved down the corridor, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted unnaturally. When they reached the door at the end of the hallway, the figure stopped, gesturing toward it with a stiff arm. Claire's heart nearly stopped in her chest as she read the number on the door. Room 22. The number seemed to burn into her vision, as if it were branded onto her soul. The door creaked open before she could even touch it, the hinges groaning in protest, and there inside was a room that felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. The sheets on the bed were yellowed with age, and the air smelled stale, like dust and decay. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a sickly glow over everything. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and Claire whirled around, only to find that the man was gone. Her body felt frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The silence in the room was deafening, and the oppressive feeling of being watched washed over her in waves. As she stood there, rooted to the spot, a soft rustling sound came from the corner of the room. Claire's eyes darted to the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. She exhaled shakily, trying to calm herself, but the rustling continued. It was as if something was moving in the dark. "Help me," a voice whispered from the corner. It was faint, barely audible, but Claire heard it clear as day. Her blood ran cold as she realized the voice sounded too familiar. It was the same whisper from earlier. The footsteps, the cough. It was the same voice. Claire rushed to the door, her hands shaking as she turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, sealed shut. Panic surged through her, but before she could scream, the voice whispered again, this time much louder. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered, and when they stabilized, Claire saw him, the man who had led her here. But now, he wasn't alone. Shadows began to creep across the walls, gathering around the figure. And then, from the darkness, dozens of pale, ghostly faces emerged, their eyes lifeless, staring at her with an unblinking gaze. Each face was twisted, distorted, as if they were trying to scream but couldn't. Claire tried to back away, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. The shadows closed in, suffocating her with their cold touch. The last thing she heard before the darkness overtook her was the voice, now shrill and filled with malice. "You will never leave." The wind howled across the barren landscape, rattling the loose shutters of the small, dilapidated house perched on the edge of the forgotten town. Emma had never been one to believe in ghost stories or supernatural whispers, but as she stepped out of her car, the sense of dread she felt creeping along her spine told her that this place would be different. She didn't know why she was here, only that she had been called to the old farmhouse by a strange, cryptic message from her late grandfather. The letter had been unexpected, a letter from beyond the grave. "Come to the old farmhouse," it had said. "You need to hear the ticking pump." She didn't understand the message, nor did she question it. She had always loved her grandfather, and the thought of finding out more about him and the secrets of the place he had spent his last years made her push aside any lingering hesitation. The house seemed alive, its creaking walls groaning as if it were breathing in the cold night air. As she entered, she was struck by the overwhelming mustiness of the air, the scent of mildew and dust mixing in with something more metallic, the smell of rust. She looked around, the silence in the room so oppressive that her heartbeat seemed to echo against the walls. Everything seemed untouched, as if the place had been frozen in time. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the outlines of chairs and tables barely visible beneath their dust-covered cloaks. And yet, in the corner of the room stood an old, wooden grandfather clock, its face cracked, the hands frozen in place. And there, in the center of the room, stood the pump. It wasn't an ordinary pump, not by any means. Its brass pipes twisted and turned in unnatural angles, almost as though they were trying to escape from the base of the machine. The pump sat on a wooden platform, surrounded by a series of strange, mechanical gears, all of which seemed to tick in a disjointed rhythm. But what unnerved Emma the most was the sound of the ticking. It wasn't just a steady tick-tick-tick like the movement of a clock. No, this was something more sinister. The ticking sounded almost as though it were a heartbeat, a slow, pulsating rhythm that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Each tick seemed to reverberate louder than the last, its echo growing deeper, as though it was coming from the depths of the house, from somewhere far below the floorboards. Her skin crawled as she stepped closer to the pump, drawn to it despite the unease growing in the pit of her stomach. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold brass, and at that moment, a shock of cold shot up her arm. The ticking stopped. For a brief, terrible moment, everything was silent. Then, from somewhere beneath the floor, a faint scratching sound began. So soft at first, it could have been the wind or the house settling. But as Emma strained to listen, the scratching grew louder. It became frantic, almost as though something, or someone, was trying to claw its way to the surface. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back from the pump, but before she could turn and run, the house seemed to groan in protest. The walls shuddered, the floor beneath her feet trembling. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a low, rumbling growl from the depths of the house. Then, without warning, the pump began to move. The gears clicked into place, the brass pipes creaked as though they were coming to life, and the sound of the ticking returned, louder now, more insistent, like the ticking of a clock winding down to its final moments. Emma felt a chill pass through her, one that seemed to settle deep in her bones. The room was growing colder by the second, and the wind outside was no longer the only sound. The ticking, the scratching, the growl, it all mixed together, creating a cacophony of dread that wrapped around her, suffocating her with its heaviness. Desperate to make sense of it all, Emma rushed toward the dusty bookshelf that lined the wall. She grabbed at the first book she could reach, a thick leather-bound tome, its cover cracked and yellowed with age. The pages inside were brittle, but she flipped through them, her fingers trembling. "Grandfather," she whispered under her breath. "What is this? What's happening?" Then she found it. Amidst the cryptic, faded text, she saw the words that would change everything. The ticking pump was never meant to stop. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The words didn't make sense, but they carried a weight, a finality that chilled her to the core. The book spoke of an old family secret, one that had been buried for generations. It told of the pump, a mechanical device designed to keep something trapped below the house. It wasn't just an ordinary pump, she realized. It was a prison, one that kept an ancient evil contained. The growling noise from below intensified, and the air in the room became thick with the smell of decay. Emma could feel the temperature drop further, her breath now visible in the cold, stale air. The sound of the ticking grew louder, more chaotic. She could no longer tell if it was the clock, the pump, or something else altogether. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave way with a loud crack. The wooden boards splintered, and Emma fell through the floor, landing in a pit of cold, damp earth. The impact left her breathless, but she quickly scrambled to her feet, disoriented and terrified. The room she found herself in was dark, barely lit by the dim, flickering light from above. The air smelled like old stone and earth. It was suffocating, and she felt the walls closing in around her. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The pump. It was no longer in its place in the center of the room. No, it was now here in the basement with her. Its brass pipes twisted unnaturally, pulsing as though alive. The ticking had become erratic, as though it were frantically trying to keep time with something much worse. Emma tried to back away, but the space was too small. There was nowhere to go, and that's when she saw it. From the shadows, something began to emerge. A figure, hunched and twisted, its face obscured by a tangle of dark hair. It was crawling toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. The growl she had heard earlier was coming from this thing, its mouth open in a grotesque snarl. The ticking, once steady and rhythmic, was now syncing with its movements, each tick corresponding to the creature's sickening crawl. Emma stumbled backward, her heart racing. "No, no, please," she gasped, but the words caught in her throat as the creature reached out toward her. The ticking grew faster, louder, until it drowned out everything else. The growl, the rustling, the wind. Everything was swallowed up by the sound of those relentless gears, turning, spinning, trapping her in its chaos. And as the creature's cold, bony fingers closed around her wrist, she realized too late that the ticking wasn't just a signal of time running out. It was the sound of something being released. The creature dragged her toward the pump, its mouth opening wide in a grin that sent chills down her spine. Emma's scream was lost in the ticking, the growling, the pounding of her heart. And as the pump pulled her in, she understood the terrible truth. Some things, once trapped, can never be contained again.